So I'd like to start off, again, my name's Carrie Ann Shirota. I'm the ACLU Policy Director. I came on board in December of last year and pretty much dived into the legislative session. And you can see in front of us the saying, the picture is worth 1,000 words. This picture is a snapshot of an event that was held earlier this year during the legislative session with partnership with some of the people who are in this group today, coming together to really talk about transforming our criminal legal system. So this is a picture at the Capitol at the reentry summit that was held, and you can see many diverse groups of people came together to elevate our voices. Next slide, please. This tends to guide the work that we do, recognizing that we live on islands, and as Les says, that we are not disconnected but connected by waters, and that the movements are born from critical connections, not critical mass. That tends to guide the work that we do. This is about relationship building, sustaining those relationships, and working together to advance, ultimately, community health, safety, and justice. Next slide, please. So here's a little roadmap for our time here today. I'll share a little bit more about my background, my why as to why I'm passionate about this work, talk about the ACLU campaigns. We have 3 overarching umbrellas. And when we say campaign work, we're talking about our entire team. I work with the policy team, but we also have field, Monica Spitia. Many of you know her. She's on this virtual meeting today, as well as Wookie Kim, who leads our legal. So when we do campaign work, we have legal as well as policy and field engaging in these areas. So our 3 campaign focus: decriminalizing poverty, which is essentially pushing to end elimination of houseless sweeps, bail reform, reimagining policing, and also smart justice. Now, our legislative priorities for this year, I believe, is of interest to you. So we're going to talk about what was our legislative packet, and then how did that evolve during the session, and what were some of the outcomes that we can highlight. And again, bringing it back to how do we focus on community engagement and building a movement. This is not just a minute, it's not about one issue, not about a particular person, but building a movement for the long haul. And we do have a call to action at the end for those of you who are burning with desire to take some action on some of the things we discussed today. So just a little bit about myself. As Les mentioned to you, I work for ACLU. Prior to this, in the past, I have worked as an attorney enforcing our state employment and fair housing laws, worked as a counselor for a Native Hawaiian program at Maui College, working with Native Hawaiian students to succeed in higher education. But also what's kind of driven me in this area too, I worked as the director of MEO's Best Reintegration Program, where we had, much like Going Home, at the same time, I was starting up simultaneously and working with the community to provide holistic, successful reentry, from housing assistance to case managers, cultural programs, substance abuse treatment. We had a hula halau. There was just this whole idea that we need to provide people as many services as possible, and that we wouldn't mandate them, that this would be something optional for them. And along with that is just a personal issue for me. I grew up on the island of Maui, and my family has been impacted by the criminal legal system in different ways. And one of my earliest memories as a child, when I was 6, my mom's brother, my uncle, was murdered. And to this day, nobody was ever arrested, convicted. But I knew, just based upon conversations, overhearing things as a child, that my grandmother was a guiding force. And she had said a comment that whoever did this to her son, my uncle, was someone's child. And that she wasn't seeking, ultimately, even if there was a death penalty, she wouldn't seek that because it wouldn't bring back my uncle, and this was someone's child. And so that vision, that lens of restorative justice, has guided me in the work today. Next slide, please. So here are some of our priority bills. I'm just going to kind of read it out like a laundry list, and we're going to talk about each of them a little bit more and allow time at the very end for questions. You know that the big issue right now surrounding HB 1567, criminal pretrial bail reform. We also had bills that were drafted for probation and parole reform. We drafted a bill for a moratorium on building and expanding jails and prisons, and to invest in alternatives to decarcerate and reduce the population through proven strategies, and a clean slate legislation that would, like it sounds, essentially wipe the slate clean for individuals who have criminal records, and after a period of time in their life that they've been successful, they haven't had any further engagement with the criminal legal system, to give them a fresh start, because we know that there are multiple barriers once you have a criminal conviction record, from access to employment, to housing, numerous barriers. So these, as you can imagine, these were heavy lifts, and it really is looking at systems changes, looking at ways that we can change systems and processes to decrease the incarcerated population from a continuum, from the front end of the system, all the way as you move through. And these system changes can be challenging, and there can be resistance involved in that process. Next slide, please. So we'll share later on a PowerPoint copy of this that we can send out. But I just want to kind of leave this quote with you. This is a famous abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. He was enslaved himself. And he essentially says that we need to be able, we can't just expect crops, right, to fruit up. You need to do the work. You need to be plowing in the field. And that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So there are times that there are power struggles, there's politics involved in the legislative process, but still there are areas where we can come together and advance public policies that benefit all of us, including our loved ones who are incarcerated and those who are justice impacted. Next slide, please. So here's some data for you. And the reason why we want to highlight this is because this helps to drive our work. This is in part how we help to shape priorities for us internally within the ACLU, but also looking at not only just to critique the system, but what are solutions and what has worked in other jurisdictions, other places, what may have worked here, but maybe we just don't have the funding to sustain that over the long haul. This is a quick snapshot in time, March of this year, over 4,000 people incarcerated. You can see here that almost 23% of all people incarcerated are pretrial status. Now, that is the entire incarcerated population combining jail and prison. But if you were to dissect that by just pretrial, it's over 50%. If you look at the number of people who are incarcerated who have been revoked from probation, oftentimes for technical violations, that's 13% of the population, or 547 people. Parole, you can see that the numbers are pretty similar. 11% of the population revoked. People who are sentenced, about 50%. And you can see here that our community supervision, meaning persons under probation, parole supervision, are over 20,000 people at any given time in Hawaii. And this is some numbers, that data we got from this organization that's leading Clean Slate nationally. When they were mining the numbers for Hawaii, it's that over 5,000 people in Hawaii are living with an arrest or a conviction record. And that should be startling for many of us. Next slide, please. So this is, again, another visual graphic. So you can see this broken down, and this is something that you can take a look at and reference when we share the PowerPoint, but you can see a big chunk of people are incarcerated for pretrial, a big chunk of it, probation, parole, and then those who are sentenced. Next slide, please. These are further breaking it down by OCCC. As you know, that there has been discussion or push to build a new jail to replace OCCC. And you can see on the left side, which is my left side, I don't know if you're seeing it, but it says pretrial people, when you break it down just to the jail population there, it's 56%. And I'm sorry I don't have the number right in front of me, but when I looked at the numbers earlier this year during the lead session, I know in Hawai'i Island, the pretrial population was closer to 60% of the entire jail population. Next slide, please. So what were our legislative priorities? You remember bail. Some years ago, the ACLU put out a bail study report, which helped to sort of drive and help move this conversation further. We did draft a bill that would change the standard, the burden, to put the burden upon the government, the prosecutors, starting with the presumption that every person is charged is legally innocent until proven otherwise. And so the presumption is one of release, and to put the burden upon the prosecutors. Now, if the court were to recommend in those situations based upon flight risk, actual absconding, not just forgetting to show up in court, and or risk of danger to a specific individual, then the court could look at other options and consider non-financial alternatives to cash bail. These bills died the session, but you can flip to the next slide. Simultaneously, there was this other bill that we knew was going to be moving forward, and it was a bill that was resurrected from the year before. This is the bill that there's been lots of media attention around, 1567, and it would eliminate the use of monetary bail, release individuals on recognizance for certain non-violent offenses, petty misdemeanors, and at the very end of the session, there was inclusion of Class C non-violent felonies, but they took out habitual property crimes and basically possession of drugs, which a lion's share of people who are arrested for Class C non-violent felonies fall into that category. But I would like to point out, we could probably spend the entire time dissecting this bill. I want to emphasize that this bill had, at this time it said 18 categories. I have to update the slide. By the end of the session, there were 20 categories of exceptions. And at the very end, it specifically states at any point in time, the court retains discretion if a person is a flight risk, or if there's a risk of harm or recidivism, that the court had the ability not to release an individual. So all the information you're hearing about is just letting people loose and people who are unsafe. The court has never lost its discretion. It would still continue. And if you look at the sort of projected numbers, this is a modest reform. It is a step forward, but we can do far more in terms of systemic changes as has been done in New Jersey and elsewhere, and with proven results to decrease the jail population without increasing recidivism rates, high rates of a court appearance over 90%, and saving taxpayer dollars that can be used for robust pretrial services and other community-based services. Next slide, please. So here's what we, again, introduced. These were actually two separate bills, probation and parole reform. Essentially, what we were advocating for is that rather than incarcerating people for a technical violation, which could be testing positive for drugs, missing an appointment with a probation or parole officer, failing to report a change in address, rather than reincarcerating people, which costs us $240 a day, that looking at alternatives to keep people in the community and get them additional support services. It would have also created a good time credit system. And we were looking at other states that have implemented reforms. And the bill at the very end included 30 days. So if 30 days compliance with probation or parole, the idea is you would reduce your time, your entire length by 30 days. So it would be a positive incentive rather than just continuing to punish people. The other thing that I would like to highlight about these bills is that unfortunately, neither became law, but we will continue to push. But the probation bill did move more towards the end than the parole. But it is an area of reform that has occurred in other states. There's good data to support it. And so you will hear more about this. And we want you to join us. And I would like to highlight for probation in Hawaii, there's a Pew report that was done in 2019 or 2020 that showed that we had the longest rate of probation compared to any other jurisdiction, our average rate at 59 months. Next slide, please. So here's the Clean Slate Act. We've listed some of the bills in the case in the future you take a look at them. This bill was drafted. Thank you, Kimmy. I see I have 10 minutes left. The bill was drafted. Unfortunately, it did not get a hearing this year, but we will continue to press forward for this. We know that there's a lot of community support for this for individuals who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, but also their loved ones, because if that person faces all of these barriers, they have difficulties getting a career or pursuing a job to make livable wages, that impacts their ability to provide for themselves, but also their family, their keiki. There's a ripple effect. And so we will continue to go back, and we want to build out the coalition and have many of you supporting us along the way next year. Next slide, please. We also drafted a bill, And the bill was drafted and we had a word that it would be introduced and it was not. There was another bill that Bob Merce drafted that would have put a pause on the planning, but we were aiming for a full moratorium, asking for a 5-year moratorium where we invest resources, time, energy into systems changes to reduce our carceral system. And some people say, well, that's impossible. We say that it's possible. For example, California, granted it was through a consent decree and federal court intervention, they decreased their incarcerated population by close to 40,000 people. 40,000 people over a period of 6 years. New Jersey over a period of 11 years and New York decreased their population like between 20,000 and 11,000. Comparatively, our entire population is 4,000. So if we invest in proven strategies from the beginning end of the system to the very end, we can clearly reduce the number of people in our jails and prisons so that we do not have to build more jails and prisons, which is proven not to enhance community safety, result in high rates of recidivism. And you can see the price tag for this was close to 1 million. Now, this bill, the pause bill to move forward with the jail died. The Department of Public Safety had already spent 10 million. They were asking for 15 million to continue planning for this jail. Keep in mind, some years ago on Maui, there was a push to build a new jail in Maui. They spent over $14 million on consultants. No jail was ever built. And that could have been spent for programs like all of you that are gathered here. Next slide, please. So what did we do? How did we pivot? We have lawmakers here with us and their staff. We know all too well that things evolve during a session and moves really quickly. So when the vehicle to have a pause on the jail building died, we thought, well, what can we do? What can we do to still advance this messaging to lawmakers? So we looked at the budget. We were carefully studying Department of Public Safety, and we started sending, calls to action, writing letters ourselves, reaching out with key lawmakers to request that they not fund a new jail and instead, again, to invest in alternatives and to beef up funding for diversion, rehabilitation, and reentry. Next slide, please. So this is one of the bills that did pass. It started off with a bill that actually did mention Going Home Hawaii as well as MEO and others. It was a bill to invest funding appropriations for diversion, rehabilitation, and reentry, community-based nonprofits. Now, it did evolve towards the end. I think it was over $1 million that was put into that funding. It does not name any specific programs, but they were actually targeting it towards a diversion type of program for women, particularly recognizing that many mothers who are incarcerated and the impacts and providing them services. So we will continue to push for more funding appropriations for community-based services like all of you. Next slide, please. So how did we do how do we keep advancing and building the movement that we spoke of? Earlier, you saw the picture. There was this reentry summit where we gathered people together. There was a lot of discussions, training from different speakers, sharing of resources, and we want to continue to focus on transformative justice and ending the dehumanization and punishment of people inside, providing them with services if they absolutely need to be in, but otherwise providing the support in our communities. Next slide. We're just going to highlight, Monica, I know is here with us, but I want to highlight some of the work of the field team. During the session, they send out literally thousands of calls to action, emails, phone calls, calling into key districts. Text messages, online actions, and you can see this is sort of the accumulation of the work that's done with the field team and the field organizers. Next slide. Thank you, Kimmy. Volunteer leadership. There are many people in the community, those of some who are with us today, who are trained at the annual advocacy training, many one-on-one conversations, responding to questions about particular bills, how would it impact them, what can they do to get involved. Lots of testimony, phone calls, and emails to lawmakers and community members to rally support. Next slide, please. Social media. That's where some of our field organizers are very skilled. You can see here some of the tracking. This is sort of the new way to help with movement building, especially some of the younger generation is very savvy. And not that it's limited to the younger generation, it's all, but I'm just revealing sort of my limitations. I'm not the most tech savvy person. And then there is a Policing Hawaii hub that we have a resource hub dealing and providing information relating to reimagining policing, which we will continue this summer. We, like you, will be working with Liam Chin. He's going to be working with us for a collective impact retreat relating to the front end of the system, relating to policing and reforms, and having less of a reliance on policing and looking at ways that we can divert resources to the community, particularly in the area of healthcare and crisis intervention. Next slide, please. So you might be wondering, what can you do if this is inspiring any of you? There were a number of other bills at the ACLU. I think there were probably over 50 some bills that we did submit testimony on. Some bills that were bad bills that we helped to defeat. Others that we commented on and suggested amendments. Some of those amendments were incorporated into the bill. You know, every year there's some victories, there's some losses and lessons learned. But for those of you that support bail reform, now in terms of the actual details of the bill, some people don't want to get involved, you know, drill down to the weeds of it. But if you support bail reform, I think it's really important for the governor to hear from you as an individual or as the collective or in your own capacity of your organizations. This is the link that we can send out. It takes you directly to the governor's site. You can put in the bill number for any of the bills. But in particular, we are mentioning that there is this call to action from the Fate Action Group to submit comments to the governor. Now, there is this Hawaii Cash Bail Coalition, which Going Home Hawaii just recently signed on to. It's at 30 different organizations who have come together. I would like to highlight Jamie Miller's here with us, Kat Brady from Community Alliance on Prisons, League of Women Voters, YWCA, MEO, that have come together to say we support bail reform. So if any of you are interested as organizations to signing on to that organization, it's going to be, Faith Action is going to continue to update that list, and we'll send that out through Kimmy and through Les to all of you. Feel free to write op-eds. There's been a series of op-eds. There are some more coming down the pipes before the governor has the ability to issue his intent to veto list on June 27th. We suspect that the bail bill could be on that list. And nevertheless, we think it's important to continue to push and advocate for these systems changes and even these modest reforms. So lawmakers like to read newspapers and get the pulse of the community. It's really important to hear from all of you. And of course, if you'd like to join the movement for some of the work that we're doing, we can also send to another link, a contact at the very end of the slide. If you can move forward, Kimmy, advance the slide. I do have the contact information a little further. Before Monica and I, you can reach out to us with and we can add you to our group list so you can get these calls to action, updates about events, legislation, and our redemption campaign that we're moving into this summer. We're a nonpartisan organization, but the work doesn't stop. We're going to be putting out a gubernatorial survey to the candidates, focusing on transformative justice and particularly clemency, which is the power of the governor to either grant reprieves, commutations, pardons to release and decrease the populations both in jails and prisons. And some governors have been using this power to contribute to decarceration. So of course, I want to leave with a thought with, you know, our beloved queen. She said, you must remember never to cease to act because you fear you might fail. And in every legislative session, there may be some victories, and sometimes it may take years to build up to that legislative victory. But at the same time, we have to continue to advocate and to champion year after year. That is true of so many changes in civil rights, the right to vote, the ending of formal slavery, and so many other things that we enjoy those privileges. So it's our kuleana to contribute and to remember and to live the words of the Queen. So next slide, please, Kimmy. I think we're getting our contact information, and we just want to mahalo you. I think I'm actually down to the minute of 20 minutes. We want to open it up for, or turn it over to Kimmy and to Les if we want to field some questions from all of you. We love questions.
Thank you so much, Carrie Ann. And we will be having a few minutes for questioning. I know we're running a little bit behind, but in respect for everyone's time, if there are more questions that keep on coming up, maybe they can contact you directly
Yes.
at the contact information that you provided. So I'll field a couple of questions right now.
And feel free to, if you feel comfortable, just raising your hand or just throwing out the question, or if you want to put it in chat.
I have a question.
Sure.
You know, you spoke of the high percentage of pretrial detainees in Hawai'i Island's facility.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if you are aware of what kinds of pretrial programs are out there that are successful. Would you know of any? Because it appears that there's a need for that.
Donna, so mahalo for your question. That is such a good question. And I think many people ask the same thing. Well, what exists? That is the question, right? What currently exists? I can just share with you, I can point to some pretrial diversion programs in some other places, and I can just speak to one program we did have back in the day for pretrial for women, which was a pilot project, but wasn't continued, which I think is a model that could be replicated. So in some other states, their pretrial services are not housed within their Department of Corrections. Like in here, the intake services under Department of Public Safety, but in other jurisdictions and in the federal government, they have pretrial services embedded in the judiciary. So it's outside of corrections. So in those, some of these other states, in particular New Jersey, I want to keep highlighting because they've implemented bail reform. They have far more robust services. So you have somebody working with you and getting you, like directing you, connecting you to services on the front end. That ideally, that is something that I think that we need to do, but also working with community groups. On the community side of it, this is some years ago, probably about 15 years ago, we had a pilot project, which was actually kind of conceptualized by someone from intake services who said, what if we try to divert more of the women who are incarcerated, recognizing that they're often in for drug-related offenses, trauma, and Class C felonies below. So it's a pilot project. We worked with MEO, worked with Maui Intake, Department of Public Safety, to start going before the court, requesting supervised release. We actually ended up renting a house specifically for women who are pretrial status, where we would have a case manager to work with them, and they could access other services within our program. So like some of the employment, housing assistance, family reunification, cultural services, the whole gamut, to help them be successful in the community prior to going to trial. And the outcomes at the time were very successful. People were doing well. That did maybe impact some of maybe the sentencing decisions in that situation. And so I think that that type of model should be, you know, replicated and duplicated in our communities.
Mahalo nui.
Mahalo to you for your question. Other questions?
Hi, Carrie. Aloha, Wendy, Akau, Women Supporting Women in Kahui Laulima. Thank you for sharing. You know, I've been addicted to meth 22 years, did 8 years in prison, been on probation, went through the whole system, went to Kentucky. I'm in total support of the Clean Slate Act, you know, since I've been home I was released, furloughed in 2010, maxed out in 2016. But since then, went back to college, got my associate in liberal arts, got my certificate in human services, got my BA in sociology, and continue to, you know, work with Women Supporting Women through our foundation. So much things that you touched on, you know, I can relate to because I've been through the system, you know, I've been through every single thing that we're talking about right now, and, you know, totally support everything that your slides just showed. The one thing I was thinking of too, and I might want to even, you know, I emailed less about it, but, you know, cleaning up the prison system somebody who made a mistake 20 years ago, still in prison. You know, I think 20 years is sufficient time for any crime, you know, unless they didn't kill somebody or the heinous of the situation. But I mean, I'm really down for cleaning up the prison system for all these people who made a mistake 20 years ago and still paying for it, regardless if it's with or without the possibility of parole. Other things I do, you know, I know you're just talking to Donna Madrid. I was in prison with a lot of women from Maui, and they would be furloughed back to the prison, and it would take them, they would get jobs, they would call for an interview, but it would take 2 weeks for them to get a ride to the place to do the interview. So they would lose the job opportunity, and you know, putting them in a house like that. I'm all for it, and trying to do something like that here in Hilo through Kahui Laulima, but I support everything that you're doing. And you know, I've been kind of out of touch because I have so much else going on in my life, but I'm glad to reconnect with everybody here. If I can call you or email you about some other stuff that I, you know, like to get involved with, that would be awesome.
Yes, mahalo, Wendy. So congratulations to you, because I know it takes a lot, right? A lot of will and support to transform your life, and your example to so many. And I've heard about you. I've seen you actually in some of the other
Thank you.
before. So mahalo to all you're doing that you bring. It's so important to center the voices and experience of people with lived, whether you've gone through it and the family. So I appreciate what you bring to this discussion, and we can stay in touch. And I will just say on the clean state legislation too, sometimes people who even get their higher education, get their degrees, there might be barriers sometimes to getting licensed, or you have to jump through all of these hoops. So a clean slate will help to alleviate that on a broader scale. And the clemency powers of a governor to able to look and to say, someone's been in for 20, 30 years. We know that people age out. Oftentimes of recidivism, there's less of a risk. Given compassionate releases that should be utilized and are not fully done. So there's so many ways that we can decrease the population, and it's proven to actually, like, and you put the services into the community, and that helps everyone, right? Family members, one's the individual.
Yeah, and I agree. One more thing I just have to say is, you know, they do offer the pardon application. When you max out, you have to have so many years, and then, but I heard that maybe only one person, the governor is the only one that can pardon your past crimes, and maybe only one person in the past 16 or 20 years was, you know, given that.
Yes,
pardon.
The pardon is infrequently used. Some other governors use it more often, which is why on this redemption campaign, we want to push the idea for the next governor coming in to educate them about the authority to use it for good. It is seldomly used, but what's different about our pardon in some other states, if you get the pardon, it actually kind of does then like expunge the record. Here in Hawaii, it's in a way more symbolic. You can be pardoned, but it still does not lead to an expungement. This bill will do both. It will be so that we have an automatic expungement over a period of time for misdemeanors or felonies, and then expungement systematically through the court system.
Thank you.
Join us.
Thank you so much, Carrie Ann, and for your questions. And if you have more questions, any one of you, please contact Carrie Ann.